Hello, Joseph Bohigian here. A quick note before we begin the episode. I recorded this interview with Raven Chacon 1 week before he won the Pulitzer Prize for music for his piece Voiceless Mass, which is why discussion of his award is conspicuously absent. Enjoy the show! Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. That was an excerpt of Compass by my guest today, Raven Chacon. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amarkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On this season of the podcast, we're talking with the featured composers from our 26th Other Minds Festival, which will take place on October 13th to 15th, 2022 at the Great Star Theater in San Francisco. Today, I'm talking with Raven Chacon. Raven Chacon is a composer, performer, and installation artist from Fort Defiance, Navajo Nation. As a solo artist, collaborator, or with Post Commodity, Chacon has exhibited or performed at Whitney Biennial, Documenta 14, Red Cat, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Borealis Festival, San Francisco Electronic Music Festival, Chaco Canyon, and a Times Festival, 18th Biennial of Sydney, and the Kennedy Center. Every year, he teaches 20 students to write string quartets for the Native American Composer Apprenticeship Project. He is the recipient of the United States Artists Fellowship in Music, the Creative Capital Award in Visual Arts, the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation Artist Fellowship, the American Academy's Berlin Prize for Music Composition, and the Pew Fellowship. Raven, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Joseph.
So I'd like to start off by asking you about the importance of place and location in your work. And I wanted to specifically ask you about your recent piece, Compass, for overly amplified electric guitar, which is one of many of your works that are meant to be performed outside. So how does location play into composition in your music?
Yeah, when I first started making music, I was trying to find ideal conditions to make recordings in. I took a recording class in there, and they must have spent a lot of those classes overemphasizing, the room, how the room should sound, and, be treated, and where you place the mics. And I began to think, if there's all this problem of reflection and, interference, then what would happen if you just recorded outside and eliminated all of that? There would be no more reflection. Of course you'd hear other things, other encroachments, the occasional car passing by, the, an airplane in the sky. But the more and more I went into an environment where those things didn't exist, then I would have less and less encroachments. And so I grew up in a pretty rural place anyway. I grew up on the Navajo reservation, and it was very easy to find quiet places. And so that was some early experiments, just making recordings outside. In fact, early on in another kind of separate part of my work, making noise and improvising, early on, there were no venues in Albuquerque that I was aware of to do this kind of thing. And I wasn't aware of the people in that city that were doing this, if there were any at that time. And so a lot of us, who were interested in just making a racket would go out to the desert and just, play as loud as we could. And so I feel like a lot of the things I was doing were just outdoors. It wasn't yet to comment on place or history or the people who have inhabited those lands. It was really just, that's where the music occurred. It was later that I started realizing, there are things to talk about in these places where I'm staging these. either recording sessions or improvisation sessions, and started to link those, started to realize that those could be the topic of the work, or the content even of what I was trying to say with these pieces.
And is that ever something that's notated into the score now, or something that's like in the background of the piece, or just something that's conceptually there?
It's always conceptually there with these pieces. And the very first work that I considered to be, something I'm still sharing with people was an early piece called Field Recordings, and that was to make a field recording of these places on quiet days at quiet times, and then turn those all the way up to their maximum. And so that was very much, using the place as the content. Other times I had a piece like maybe the gun piece report that I wrote back in 2001. And of course that has to be done outdoors. But I began to realize after doing a performance of this and documenting it that it was important to see the place. It started to allow the viewer to have questions about where that was, who the people were involved, what are they shooting at, and what's the history of that place. And so, all the way through to the installations I did with Post Commodity, where a lot of those times, those are very site specific. A lot of times those were done outdoors, and those were very much just kind of, they were pieces that were specifically made for those places and probably cannot be done any other place, or transported to another place. They would lose their meaning if that were done. But as far as notation, it's not necessarily something that's put in the notation. In the opera Sweetland that I co-composed over 2018 to 2020 with Du Yun, that was specifically done for Los Angeles. And we knew already the site that we were going to be working with. We knew that the subway train, the metro train would be running right through the opera site. We knew that there'd be, police helicopters in the sky. So even though we didn't know exactly when those events would happen, we anticipated them and kind of wrote space or references inside of the score that those would be coming through. The piece Compass that you were speaking about, I think that might maybe be one of the first times where I ask the performer to specifically look at their surroundings and use that as information for how they play the score. So certain things aren't necessarily notated in there, but the instruction to observe or listen to your surroundings is definitely in there. And so, that's not necessarily something site specific, but it's going to apply to wherever the performer decides to perform this piece. And so it's a way of not only just kind of, what some might consider deep listening, but also just deep attention to the surroundings, to the wind, to animals, to shadows, to anything else that might be able to provide, let's say, direction of where to navigate inside of the score.
As we were talking about notation, I think the notation of compass in particular might be an interesting thing to talk about as well. You've done a lot of scores with graphic notation. With the title of this piece, Compass, the score is very directional as well. And I've seen with the interview you gave, there's maybe something interesting there with the idea of a compass and direction and location. If you could talk about that, the score for that piece a little bit as well.
I've been interested for a long time in the way that things align, in nature, in our everyday lives. I mean, to a broader extent, the universe, just lining up accidents on top of other accidents, synchronicities. You go outside and you, I don't know, are reading a book about birds, and maybe a bird lands right there at your feet, and what does that mean? Does that have meaning? Is that just a coincidence? Is that music when those kinds of things happen? Or maybe something quite opposite happens. You're reading the book about birds and a car crash happens down the street. What is inside of that? Not only as a sonic event, but as narrative, as as something aligning with something that was already ongoing. Maybe some accident, some one-time event that would happen amongst a frame of time that you have either composed or found yourself inside of. And so I think these more recent works, starting with Compass, and I'm thinking that more are to come, are looking into that, considering ourselves, our bodies, our placement inside of the world, and, how we encounter these other events that are happening, whether they are, other beings, other elements of nature, like I said, the sun, the wind, rain, and how all of these kind of might have some kind of counterpoint to them, how they interact with each other, how they move in parallel motion or contrary motion, the thing we're taught in music theory and counterpoint. I think these are kind of, for now, just kind of studies in that, and I'm not a scientist or anything by any means, and I'm not really talking about that. I think I'm talking more about just I don't know, maybe something that's an awareness, and I don't want to call it meditation either, or any kind of kind of spiritual attention, but it's maybe since we composers and musicians deal with time, trying to understand maybe some kind of structure around these synchronicities.
Let's listen now to an excerpt of Compass by Raven Chacon, performed by Zoe Wallace. So I wanted to ask you now, since we were talking about pieces that were written for specific locations, you mentioned a little bit about your opera that you co-composed with Duyan's Sweetland. Could you tell us a little bit about the story of that opera and connection to place as well?
Yeah, the project of Sweetland started way back, actually, in maybe 2017. I was approached by Yuval Sharon, the director and producer of Sweetland, who is at the time, doing projects with the industry in LA, the opera company, who does quite adventurous work. And I had heard, I think a lot of people had heard about this opera they did, Hopscotch, that took place in cars all over downtown LA. And when Yuval reached out, I definitely was interested in working with him and the industry because of that, adventurous spirit and experimental kind of staging that they did by doing that in cars on the freeway, that's definitely something that's not sinkable. Trying to put cars on the streets of LA, any number of things can happen there. And so I like that. I like that. It's a huge risk to try to do these kinds of projects. And so I knew that they were thinking big. And we met up, and there was an initial possible collaboration with an opera company on the East Coast who wanted to do an opera about the first Thanksgiving. And the reason for this was that the anniversary of Plymouth Rock was coming up in 2020, I think the 400-year anniversary. And so I thought of, it didn't take me long to have an answer. I said, I don't know if I want to do this. It just conjured kind of strange, I don't know, theater out of it. I'm thinking I can. The only reference for me is when you have to do some kind of Thanksgiving play in elementary school or something, and there's construction paper, headdresses and pilgrim hats, and more importantly, I don't know what happened there. I don't know what happened at the first Thanksgiving. And Yuval agreed. He said, there's not going to be a right way to do this, especially if our motivation is to try to do something historically accurate. And so we both decided the most interesting thing to do would be to respond to this anniversary and speak about the myth, the fact that we don't know what happened. We were taught a certain thing about this encounter, but we don't know exactly what happened. We know that violence has been erased from these encounters, the narratives of these encounters. And importantly to me, especially as you mentioned, place or specificity of place, is that the encounter of the Europeans into the Americas happened in all different parts of what's now the United States. So it happened in the Southwest with conquistadors from Spain, and it happened on similarly in the West Coast, in California, and it wasn't necessarily this kind of east to west manifest destiny. It was happening all over the country at different times. And so we started there, kind of mixing these stories together, these myths, and talking about the dual nature of their, how they've been taught to the public or received as kind of general fact. And so what happens is that you see actually two operas. Depending on the ticket that you have, you might see one storyline about the first Thanksgiving, or it's not ever referenced as Thanksgiving, it's just called a feast. But then we see that feast again a second time as being something that's more a forced marriage ceremony. And if you see the other opera, you do see that, building of the railroad from east to west, which we of course know that it also came from west to east and met somewhere in the middle. But when you see it the second time, you see kind of the aftermath of that development. You see where that has brought us in the 20th century and the 21st century, the scarcity of real estate and the claiming of lands ongoing. And so, in working on this opera for 2 or 3 years, it very much became about Los Angeles, because a lot of these histories ended up at the end of the line, so to speak, which is, the trains end up at the end of the coast there, and they end up in Los Angeles, and a lot of trade goes between there and the East Coast. And because of that, you had a lot of other communities. You had people who were there because it was also Mexico before it was, United States. And ongoing, you have people from Mexico migrating there for work. You have people from China ending up there. You still have a native population there in Los Angeles. So all of those stories, more kind of recent stories, ended up as the finale of the opera. But if we ever do this piece again, we did design it to be adaptable and transposable should we end up doing it in the Midwest, let's say, or the South, or even back on the East Coast. Because there's elements of these same histories, this same colonization, these encroachments into the land, and massacres and riots and other injustices have happened in every corner of this country. So I think if we were to do this again, there would be some minor changes, and would be able to adapt it to other places that have seen a shared history.
Let's listen now to an excerpt of Feast 2 from Sweetland by Raven Chacon, performed by the Industry.
Dear, dear, right there is where you stand. Ah, blushing bright, upon an apple or catch upon a cherry. So red, red, red. Won't do for proper weddings, like blood upon an apple or ketchup on a This stove is good, authentic shit, like a granny snake. An appetite can bite you back. Good outgrows the spirit. Dear, dear, right there is
One question that has come up as I've been looking through a lot of your work is that a lot of your work refers to your DNA heritage, but I heard in an interview that you said an artist's role is to escape even their own people sometimes. And I thought that was really profound. And I come from a culture, Armenian culture, that having dealt with the threat of extinction is very, very focused on preservation. And that can at times feel sort of stifling as an artist who's trying to do something new and experimental. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you view your role as an artist who's engaged with your cultural heritage without getting trapped in sort of the expectations of your identity and community and preservation and trying to do something new.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. That's thank you for sharing that. It's something I'm still thinking about. I think I probably said that as a bit of a disclaimer, in that I am not necessarily doing the work of education always through my artwork. I think that's why we have teachers. That's why I highly respect and value the good teachers that are doing that kind of work, and other historians and other leaders in our communities, sharing that story. And I think artists can do a great job of that too, bringing awareness to history, to atrocities, to genocide, and to needs, that are needed by the people who have survived these injustices and everything else. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful not to lose the opportunity to complicate the history, to question where we are going, to have inside jokes between our people, that aren't always known to other people. I think it might be something that even teachers and others might not have the ability to do, is to go in these kind of cracks in between the story and look at those, and also as artists and especially as musicians, the work might not always be about that. It might not always be about who we are, where we come from. It might be about other things, other worldviews that we have that have resulted because of our histories, but there's other things to talk about. And so I think that might be a way that I'd like to answer, is that there's a burden there, but there's also an urge that we might want to talk about other things, or recognize our histories, ourselves, our ancestors, but also use those as guides to get to other places that nobody might go, who didn't grow up that way, didn't have that experience, or doesn't have that history in their family.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's I think something that's really important for especially young artists like myself to remind ourselves as we're navigating these ways to incorporate our own heritage into our work. So you'll be performing on the Other Minds Festival 26 on October 13th with Guillermo Galindo. Could you talk a little bit about your collaboration with Guillermo and what you'll be doing with him on the Other Minds Festival?
Yes, I met Guillermo, I think back in 2017, maybe 2016, had began communicating with him. We at the time I was a part of a collective, Post Commodity, and we were doing some writing about some other artists that we were interested in, and wrote a section on Guillermo's work. And the year after that, we were both Guillermo and Post Commodity were both invited to Documenta 14, the exhibition that was being held in Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany. And it was there, I think, that I first got to meet with Guillermo and hang out. And, all of us in the collective were hanging out with him. But Guillermo and I, of course, come from kind of the same kind of background in terms of being trained classically. And he also is a pianist. That was my first instrument. But, of course, like many composers, you might stop playing that instrument for a while and go on to, start composing. And he too had, played in rock bands and just, had involved himself in all different kinds of music making, including the building of instruments, which is something too that I had been interested in for a long time. And so we'd always been meaning to get together to just make music. I think we actually did many times, just at after some drinks at somebody's apartment, or here and there, but had been waiting for some opportunities to have some kind of duo, and play together. And then when COVID hit, all of that kind of was put on hold until more recently, that we were able to perform together at a gig in Dexical in Santa Cruz. And there was no, I know the instruments that he likes to use, and he knows my rig. And so that was enough to just trust, combining everything and setting it all up and just going for it, for 50 minutes or so. And I feel that I know enough about his kind of instincts of how he plays and the sounds that he likes, and what is in his battery, that he brings. And, he's shared the same about what I do,
And can you say what you're performing on?
I don't know.
Okay.
We might just show up with whatever we got, but I could say that his instruments, he likes to use sometimes the percussive instruments that he's made, these things that he's found on the border, or these other found objects, and they end up as other kinds of percussive instruments. So I know he has one instrument that is a bunch of shotgun shells that he found out in the desert, and he turned those into like a rattle, a shaker. Mm-hmm. And I've seen him use wind instruments sometimes, walkie-talkies, radios, those kinds of things. And I like to use, there's a few things I always use. I always use a couple of field recordings that are, kind of pre-recorded onto some cassette tapes. And then I'm usually have 2 or 3 cassette recorders that I can record with in real time and then, play back on a loop tape. And so I always record the set in real time, whatever we're doing, audience included, nothing direct, just the Walkman is sitting on the table recording everything in the room. And then that gets fed back into the mix somehow and reprocessed. I use voice a lot of times, and that's usually run through some kind of distorted gate thing. And recently I've been, I haven't been bringing homemade instruments too much to gigs because I had bad luck with them breaking on the way to the gig. And some of them are quite cumbersome, but so I use a lot of, kind of pedals, guitar pedals these days, but I've been doing this thing by plugging in like 3 or 4 reverse pedals, like reverse delay pedals, so that it sounds like it's going one way, but then it goes another way. And it kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It's its own contradiction to plug 3 or 4 of those things into each other.
Sure,
they don't know which way they want to go. So yeah, timbrally and temporally, I think they do something really interesting that I'm still experimenting with. And there's usually some kind of friction instrument. So for me, for a long time, it used to be this deer antler that I would scrape onto glass. And that was another one that was getting too hard to travel with. So that turned into a wooden spoon and a sheet of plexiglass.
That's quite the shift.
Yeah, but it sounds similar. But there was used to be these tones I would be able to get with the antler, because all 3 prongs occasionally would hit almost like a chord, like a triad or something.
Oh, wow.
Like 3 little screams coming out of it. But that's another instrument, and whatever else, usually some kind of whistle or little wind instrument I like to bring. And yeah, I think, and voice as well. I mean, both Guillermo and I using voice in a way that's not, it's not necessarily singing. It's some kind of vocalizations, but I think both of us process them in ways that are, you can't tell their voice oftentimes. So I like, in this last performance we did, I was really happy with the combinations. Again, the accidents that can happen in improvisation or elsewhere that lined up. And so I'm really happy we get to do it again for Other Minds.
Let's listen now to Raven Chacon performing with Guillermo Galindo at Indexical. That was Raven Chacon performing with Guillermo Galindo at Indexical. You'll be able to hear them perform at Other Minds Festival 26 on October 13th, 2022 at the Great Star Theater in San Francisco. Thank you, Raven, for joining me today.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 26th festival is October 13th through 15th, 2022 at the Great Star Theater in San Francisco. Until next week.